Welcome, everybody. We're delighted to have you with us today. This is the Utah Valley Technology and Genealogy Group meeting, the second Saturday of the month. Today is the 9th of April of 2022, and we're broadcasting this from the Red Chapel in the Edgemont area of Provo. This is the first time in 2 years that we've been doing this live in person as well as on Zoom. Due to the COVID pandemic. So we're delighted to welcome all of you with us. There are several people there live in the chapel in person, and the rest of us are on Zoom, and a bunch of you are on Facebook. And this is being recorded, so you may be watching this 6 months or a year from now. But we welcome you wherever you are and whatever time you're watching this. I'm Don Snow. I'm in St. George, Utah, down in the desert. Laurie Castillo, our speaker, is online with us. She's in Orem, Utah. And Gerhard Roof, our host, he's there in the Red Chapel. We're going to start with a prayer, and we've asked Marilyn Thompson, who's the editor of our monthly newsletter, Tagology, if she would offer our opening prayer. Marilyn?
Thank you. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we come before Thee with a prayer in our heart that Laurie will be able to teach us, and we will be able to hear and be able to understand and be able to be inspired and understand how to use what she desires to teach us to gather these families upon the earth. Father, we also ask Thee to bless those around us, that they will be able to have a safe day, and that they will be able to accomplish the things that they desire, and that they will feel Thy Spirit as they go about their day. We thank Thee so much for so many who have taken the time to be able to make this effort work. We are grateful for the angels who assist us in this work, and for our ancestors and the things that they do for us on this earth. We love Thee, Father, and are so grateful for Thy love and assistance. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Marilyn. Marilyn is the editor of our newsletter, our monthly newsletter, and it's a major document that comes out every month, that if any of you are interested in receiving a sample copy of it, on our webpage and also on the blog, there is a way that you can request a sample copy. Just send a note to, let's see, we got a brand new one, uvtagginfo@gmail.com. And if you just send a note in there and say you'd like a sample copy, we'll send you a sample copy, and you can decide if you want to join with us. 2 or 3 items before we introduce Laurie. We hope that you've taken advantage of the 1950 U.S. Census that has just come out. It's not completely searchable yet, but you can find information on there, and we've been able to find some of us who are old codgers and codgerettes are on there ourselves, but certainly our parents or grandparents are on there, so that's worthwhile you're knowing about. There are just lots of other things. Remember that Roots Tech is still online with all the information from that. Lots of other things going on, and lots of good information available. And our organization has been, well, we're 31 years old already, and lots of things happening. Now, I believe that's everything that I need to talk about for commercials as far as what's going on. So let me introduce our speaker today. Laurie Werner Castillo, is our first vice president of our organization, Utah Valley Technology and Genealogy Group. And she and her husband, Jerry, who's also working with us in UVTAG, live in Orem. Laurie grew up in Los Angeles. She was born in Santa Monica, and I used to go to the beach down there, Laurie, in Santa Monica. She grew up in West Los Angeles and did all kinds of things in high school, various things. There's a long information about her on our blog. And on the blog, you'll also find her email address. You see it on the screen right now, jengal@comcast.net. but she has 2 or 3 other email addresses. So there's ways to get in touch with her. If you want to find our blog and get the press releases, go to the blog, just do a Google search for UV tag and then blog, and it'll come up right at the top. And you can subscribe there to get to receive our monthly press releases with it. Laurie's a professional genealogist and does all kinds of genealogy work with various things, including European stuff, as well as here in the U.S. Nearly every place in the U.S. she's done information and research, and she's a prominent genealogist. She speaks all over the place, and a lot of her classes are at the BYU Family History Library in the BYU library there, where she does lots of classes, and they're all online too, so you can, you'll be able to see. I don't want to take any more time because she's got lots to tell us about. So she's going to talk, first of all, the main presentation is why can't I find my family, as you see on there, digging deeper on surnames. Then we'll have a break. And if you're watching this on Facebook, you'll have to do the break. And during that break, those of us on Zoom who are members of the organization will be doing our elections with the voting on the polling on it. And then she'll come back on again and give us a class, and we'll introduce her on the class later. So Laurie, let's turn the time over to you right now so that you could tell us about surnames and why can't I find my family. Go ahead.
Thank you. When you think about surnames as a topic, it seems like it should come up more often than it does, because if you can't find the surname of your ancestors, or if you can't keep track of it while you're trying to go backwards, you're nowhere. You know, we need a surname to work with, and the most valuable piece of information. All right. I wanted to talk about my surname for a minute. My maiden surname was Werner. It's German. It was often mispronounced in California as Warner because we didn't live that far from the Warner Brothers studios. It should be pronounced more like Werner in the German. And the original German spelling, as I've seen it now in the records, is the W-O with the umlaut, the 2 dots over it, Werner, you know. And there's other versions of that German spelling as well. So when did my family stop pronouncing it like it should be pronounced and switch to something a little more anglicized? I don't know. I didn't think to ask it until there wasn't anybody left to ask the question. My married name is Spanish. It's often mispronounced Castillo. It should be pronounced Castillo with the accent on the center syllable, and the 2 L's are silent. You say to yourself, why would that be? Well, let's think about it. You don't say tortilla, do you? Oh, I hope not. And then let's talk about my given name. It's Laurie, L-A-U-R-I-E, and I get Laurie a lot. But I tell people it's Laurie with all the vowels. So. Okay, so let's talk about when records are being created. The information giver. Was the information giver a witness of the event, a relative, a friend, a neighbor, a father? Fathers can be a little dangerous in the witness department. I could tell you a story about how my Uncle Roy got confused, and at church he said their daughter's name was Susan Jeanette, but his wife had told her no, it was Susan Janet. So one thing was on her church records and another thing was on her civil records, and my aunt was a forceful woman, so I know she got her way about that. Was the information giver literate? You know, literally, sometimes, you know, they went in and said, this is the name. And even if the person held up the the book or the paper and showed it to them, they might not have been able to tell, if that was the right name written down or the spelling they'd been told to use. And was the information giver a local person? Because if they weren't, they might have had an out-of-town accent that was hard to deal with. The other thing is, did the information giver have a hearing issue or have a speech impediment or missing teeth, so that when they spoke the name to the recorder of the details, it didn't sound like it was supposed to sound? Did they have, like I said, a non-local accent? Were they educated so that they could actually give the exact spelling? And I've heard that sometimes at these family parties for baptizing the baby or whatever, there was a little booze flowing, and sometimes the person who was giving the information or recording it was a little bit too inebriated, and that didn't help anything. Now let's talk about that record keeper. Was the record keeper a witness to the actual event? Were they local? I'll talk about the priests of Arzbach later, and how they changed some of my family names. Was the record keeper really literate? And were they sober? And did they have a hearing issue, or did they have proper training in how they were supposed to record the record? Did they understand the local ethnicities and local culture and that sort of thing? Well, what does get recorded? What the reporting person said? No. What the recording person heard? No. What gets recorded is what the record keeper thought he heard. So that's just a little something to think about. All right. I should say at this point that my mother actually said to me, a lot of people must think I came from a real genealogy family. I really didn't. My mother actually said the fatal words, if it's not spelled W-A-L-L-E-Y, it's not my family. So she was not willing to accept anything, even though her family had long been farmers and people of not much education. She still thought that everything was going to be recorded perfectly and correctly. All right, so as far as cultural happenings, let's talk about that. Let's talk about spelling variations. One of my surnames in Germany is Duke, and it actually in the earlier records starts out in the French format of D-O-U-Q-U-E or D-U-C. It's an ancient French name from Brittany. And it comes from a person, either a person who puts on the airs and graces of a duke, or for a servant who worked in the household of a duke. In German, the spelling actually got to where it looked like duck, or you see these with the E and other vowels in there. In the Spanish or Portuguese, this name would come out as D-U-Q-U-E. In the Netherlands, it would have the accent mark at the end. And in Latin, it appears as D-U-X. So in old records, when they're keeping them in Latin, you might actually see that version of the name. So that's something to think about, that depending on the background of your family and how those spellings may differ. All right. Females may not change their surnames at marriage. There are a number of countries where females traditionally retain their surnames. I love to do research in the Netherlands, and that's because on the census, the ladies are listed by their maiden names. In fact, in all the records, they are. The Iberian countries are this way. Other Spanish-speaking countries, some of the Asian countries. And if I remember right, I think Hungary might be that way as well. So that's one thing you need to check on when you're looking at the country, following your surname backwards. Does your family come from an area where the woman would have retained her surname? All right, how about name order? Countries, there's two different ways the countries do this. One is Western name order. That's the European sort of the way we do it, where we do the given name, then the surname. The other version is called Eastern name order, and that's family name and then given name. And that's very typical of the Asian cultural sphere and Hungarian. Oh, this is where the Hungarians belong. The Hungarians actually do this. And I've seen a number of records now where this is very apparent. So if you didn't know that, you might get in there and get your ancestors all backwards. You know? All right, let's talk about sources of surnames. We have the patronymic, matronymic, or ancestral name, so a name that comes from a parent or an ancestor. The place of abode or nearby landmark, occupation, and personal description, traits, nicknames, physical features, something that gave a nickname or gave a name. Let's first talk about patronymics. This is just an example of some from different countries, from the O's and the Micks and the Fitzes from Scotland and Ireland. We've got the typical Scandinavian surnames where it's S-O-N or S-S-O-N for the males. And let me say, if you look down here at the bottom at Parsdaughter, the females, when they're doing this patronymics, the females, the only correct way to list them is with the daughter or the DTR at the end of the name. I've seen people, I can tell if people know what they're doing with Scandinavian research just by looking at their group sheets and their pedigree, because if they have son after on the female names, I know they don't know that how to do it correctly. And this is the correct way, the way they did it there. Now, you'll see like an et will be sometimes a son of name, like this Gillette here. So that really means son of Giles. The Welsh names, Jones and Johns, that S at the end stands for son. And in England, they would just call that Johnson. And so you can see here, there's the Olsen with the EN, and that would be more likely, that would be from Denmark, possibly Norway with the EN there. And the Perez, the EZ is the son of kind of thing for in Spanish. So a lot of countries have been party to that type of naming style. Let's talk about location. There'll be geographic features. A person who lived near a moor, that's how you get the name Muir. Hill, bush, ford, which is a river crossing, by the way. Atwood, kirk is the British word for church, and then something like a stone. There might be a big stone or a boulder. You might be named after a town or a city, like London, Eton, Oxford, Carlisle. You might have a surname. You've heard of people who have, like John French. French is their last name. I had a neighbor who I worked with, and one of her main surnames was de Spain, which literally means from Spain. So actually, and this is really crazy, but in my German family, one of my surnames is Portugal. And I haven't seen that far enough back to figure out why a German would pick up the name Portugal, but maybe back far in time, there was somebody who came from Portugal. I don't know. Let's talk about occupation surnames. You know what Smith and Baker and Taylor and Miller are. A Sawyer is a woodcutter. A Chandler is a candle maker. A Fletcher is an arrowsmith. A Cooper a barrel maker, and a Wagner. See, there's the German creeping up. Okay, Wagner is a wagon maker. A descriptive surnames. These can be pretty funny. Baines would be bony, and Crookshanks would be bow-legged. A Ballard or Peel means bald-headed. Reed is red-headed. Power or poor is for poor. Engelhart is the German for angel heart. Weisskopf literally means light-haired. In French, you have, well, sometimes it comes out petit now. It should be petite or petit, and that would be small or petite. Long or lang means tall. Klein in German is small, and gross is large. Best is actually the word beast transformed slightly. In French, we have Le Grand for somebody who's big, and Le Blanc for somebody who's blonde. There's a lot of people with the name Stout, and that would be somebody who's either steady or maybe heavy or large. And Careless. I always worried about people named Careless and Loveless. Love to know the derivation of those, but it can mean carefree, or it could mean clumsy. So it could go either way there. You can't really make a judgment call about your ancestor because you weren't there. So is meaning always clear? One of my main German surnames is Knopf. And there's at least 3 possibilities for the meaning of that. Someone who lived by a rounded hill or hillock. And I know where these people lived, and they did actually live by a rounded hillock in the area. But it could be a description or a nickname for like a small rotund person, or it's a name often given to button makers because they're making something round. Okay, now there's phonetic variations. This happened a lot of times when people came to America and they were trying to get their name into a way that either didn't betray their ethnicity or was easier for people to pronounce. And so you see that Schwartz goes from the German with the SCH Schwartz to different endings, to now losing the SCH and eventually winding up in a more English looking form in Schwartz. The French Charbonneau actually passed through several versions, and I've actually seen it spelled with the SH, with just the BONO at the end. Meyer is one of those names in German that has a million spellings, and the way, it could start out in any one of these ways and end up, in fact, the more English version of that is the MYER. So people, some who are trying to lose the German, did that. I was working on an extraction project once where on one page, I saw 24 spellings of the name Campbell. They were with and without the P, one or two L's, 1 or 2 M's. I mean, it was amazing. Pierce has a whole lot of renditions, as you can see here. The French Fontaine can migrate to fountain, but there was a lot of different spellings for that in between. And in France, it may well have been La Fontaine or De La Fontaine. The Kuhlmann surname, German, has migrated in America to the Coolman spelling. So you can see how you would miss this if you were looking in an index, if you didn't think to check a different opening letter, even like Charbonneau. And then there's Schneider, which, Taylor, and you can see how that, it got down to the British forms, SNYDER. This Zneda is actually the Polish form of Snyder. There's Taylors in every language, so. So our immigrant ancestors had 2 choices if they were trying to make their name more livable in the New World. They could keep the spelling, but change the pronunciation to pronounce it like it looked, if it didn't pronounce the way it looked in their home country. Or they could keep the sound and spell it so it would be pronounced as they wished in English. Or if they wanted to not do either of those choices, they could translate, they could truncate a name, or they could create a new one. And we've talked about translate, but we'll talk about the other 2 as we go along. So one question I wanted to pose was, are vowels the enemy? Vowels are something that you really, really have to watch out for, because a vowel with the right accent, any vowel could sound like any other vowel. I mean, you've heard vowels pronounced by people from the South, and that sounds totally different than vowels pronounced by people from New England or, elsewhere. Now, so I had there's a German surname Urban, but it's also seen spelled in all these other ways. And you could actually spell it with an E for the vowel. You could spell it with an I for the vowel. You could spell it with an O, and really you could spell it with a U too, and come out with a name that sounded really similar. And with the right accent, it could even have an O. I mean, it could even start with an O. So, and consider also when you're looking at, if you were looking at these names and trying to think of everything that could have happened, any of these spellings could also have wound up with two N's or two N's and an E at the end, for example. So vowels can sound very different in different languages and with different accents. And those are something to always watch out for. In fact, when I use a wildcard searching, I'm most often replacing a vowel because I want to make sure I don't miss something. That's a great way to handle Scandinavian names, so you don't have to worry about if it's O-N or E-N. All right, so I want to give you an example that I saw when I was a very young genealogist, and I've never quite gotten over it. This was not my research, this was somebody else's research, but this is how it went. There was an English couple who had 5 children, and in the birth registry, the names were listed as follows. The first one was Hancock, the second, Hancock, the third, Hancocks. The fourth was listed Handecock, and the fifth one, Hancocks. So what's going on here? That's an accent, right? These, the ones that start with A, we call that a Cockney accent, you know? So it was different people, obviously, that reported these births. And a couple of times it was somebody that had that accent where the H is not spoken. And that could thoroughly change where your name winds up in an index, a listing, a census, a birth report. I respect somebody way back then for being able to actually locate these names misspelled like that. So this is, I want to throw in a little bit about given names too, because, you know, as we're searching for our ancestors, that becomes part of the problem. So if you know where your ancestor came from by, for instance, you see them putting the country in the census, you know, it shows where they're from, but they're saying the name is John. And it's not a country where the name would have actually been John, then that's a clue for you as to where they might have come from. And this is just part of the list. I think I've given you a web link for where you can find John in all these languages in the world. But you can see here that John doesn't even start with J all the time. In some places it's with a G or an I, an E, an S. Here's some H and O and a Y. So an E for Evan for in Wales. So that's something to think about, that a lot of times people just, I know that my ancestors immediately anglicized their given names when they got to America, at least on the records. I imagine amongst themselves, they still use their original names, but as far as all the record keeping goes, they switched to the anglicized version right away. Let's talk about translated surnames. Sometimes this is what people did when they came to America. The Ackermann became the farmer. These are all German examples because, you know, that's the surname I do primarily. But so I just wanted to show you some of those. Bergman. Bergman is a miner. A Fisher looks, of course, like what it is. Fleischer is a butcher. Gerber, like Gerber baby food, is really a tanner. Jager is a hunter. Kaufmann is a merchant. You know, Cutter is a farmer. There's a lot of words for farmer in German. A Mauer is a mason. A Schlosser, a locksmith, Schmidt, of course, and there's very many spellings of that. Ends up as Smith, and you can just see some of the rest of these here. Zimmermann is carpenter, and then there's names. There's names that are not occupation, but other descriptives like Sonntag, which is Sunday, and Kirche, which is church, and Schwarz, which is black, and Weiß, which is white. So their ancestors may have done something like that. You know, if you can see that they're saying they're from Germany, but their name is an English word, this may well be what happened. There's a German name, Feuerstein. I think I'm saying that right. The literal translation of it is Firestone. And this was the original name of those people from Akron, Ohio, who started cranking out the tires, helping Henry Ford. But these are some of the other spellings of that name. But there are other possible meanings, you know. Firestone, it could be a flint or a seller of flints, because a flint is a stone used for starting a fire. It could be someone who lived near an outcropping of flint, someone who was hard-hearted, or someone who was physically tough. So when your ancestor, if they were named Feuerstein when they came to America, they might have become Firestone, they might have become Flint, who knows? The French version of this is or which literally is stone of fire. And I actually found an example of this in French census from 1876. You can see Fou right there. Claude is his first name. So I thought that was kind of fun. Ancestry.com. I used their name information thing and plugged in Firestone. And it actually shows, and this is up in the corner, you can see here what it either is the 1880, I think, or the 1910 or 20 census you can switch it to. And so this is in earlier days, and you can see that there they are. They're in Ohio. Pennsylvania is where they first came in, and then they came into Ohio and began to work in the tire industry. Let's talk about a Swedish immigrant ancestor of my cousin Sharon's husband, who I did the research for. When she gave original information on him, she says, his name is Charles A. Lanier. And I said, that can't be true. And she said, it can't? And I said, no. His original, that nobody's named Charles in Sweden. His name will be Carl when I find the records over there. And Lanier isn't the original surname either. The original surname will have been a patronymic. So here was what happened as I went backward in time. I found Carl August Lanier being born in 1857. His father was Eric Gustav Johannesson Lanier, who was born in 1824. So you can see at this time, he's wearing the patronymic of his father, Johannes, but he's got Lanier also, his name. His father, Johannes, was Johannes Håkansson Lanier, born in 1788. And here's his father, Pettersson. So you can see that they started out with just using a patronymic name. About the time that this Johannes was a grown man, people were starting to take on, people who were a tradesman, were starting to take on surnames that were representative of their surname. So Lanier, the basis for Lanier is linen. And these people were linen weavers and linen dealers. And so by the time Carl August was a grown man, they had done away. It was about 1860 where they really began changing the surnames in Sweden. And so he dropped the patronymic and just Lanier, which is really good for us because that is a really uncommon name. So kind of appreciate them. I was working in Medina County, Ohio, and got into a Mennonite community there. And as I watched over time in the census, Culp became Culp, and the Kuhlman, the second one, became Kuhlman. They dropped the double N and made it C-O-O-L. The Rockenfelders, this is where the Rockefellers come from, is the Rockenfelders. Sheets could become sheets, and Schumacher became shoemaker. This is another way, that they could keep the sound of the name, but make it doable for people who do not understand German pronunciation. Let's talk about uniquely created surnames. In Hispanic countries, we have dual surnames. So I'm using my husband as an example. This is what his name would be if he lived in Mexico, because that second name is his mother's surname. The problem with this is that a lot of Anglo people did the early extraction of Mexican records. They slid to the end of the line because they thought that the last name should be the last name. And so when you're doing Spanish research, you have got to look by either of these surnames in either order, and either one of them alone, just to make sure you haven't missed the person you're after. Now, if we had a son named Michael, he would be Castillo y Werner, right? Or sometimes they just put a hyphen in there these days. If we had a daughter, Anna, who married a man named Jones, her name would be Anna Castillo y Werner de Jones. So that when there's a "de" in there, that's a designation of an appendage name that's not related to the parents. So you need to check out, in some Hispanic countries, or Portugal, the names can be the other way around. You want to be sure when you start on a new country that you go to the personal name section of the genealogy in the Family Search Wiki, and it will give you instructions about how the names work. I had in the assessment. I had a Shelto, believe it or not, I wound up doing Dutch research and I absolutely love it. But I had a guy named Shelto Koolhaas Vanderwode, and the rest of his siblings were just Vanderwodes. And I thought, how did Shelto get in the bonus from here? Well, it turned out that he had a grandfather. The Vanderwode is a family of ministers in the Netherlands. And he had a grandfather who was a famous minister whose surname was Koolhaas. And the man didn't have any daughters. So they got permission. They went down to wherever you do your names there in the Netherlands, and they got permission to give him the extra surname to honor the grandfather and to keep this going. So that's a family where all the children all have the same surname, and things like that did happen. So it's just another example. So let's talk about Peter Van Dyke. Do you see how this could cause a name to be hard to find? Because it depends on whether, when they're doing the indexing, whether they keep the spaces or they shove the names together, and whether the person who's doing the indexing understands what to do with the van. These are other, if your name was Van Dyke, it literally means somebody who lives by the dike, okay? So, these are other forms of the spelling, and this is, you'll see this when you go back in time. The Y, what they use as a Y now in older Dutch was represented by an I right next to a J. And you can see it looks like a Y, it pronounces like a Y, but that's the older spelling of that name. Another name that somebody who lived by the dike could also have is Dijkman, or Opendijk, or Updijk, or Van Dijken. So your ancestor could, over the course of time, be going by variants like that. So that's something to keep in mind. A lot of times people didn't know what to do. Oh, one other thing I wanted to tell you about the Dutch names is I've been in an area where, where a lot of Dutch people were living, and on the census, everybody has a V period for their middle name, and you can tell the census taker did not know what to do with the van. So that could also happen where it's just stripped down to that last word. In fact, when they actually alphabetize in the Netherlands, they usually do it by just the, not the van part, but just the last word in the line there. So here's one of those O names, and it's possible you'd see this with an apostrophe or without an apostrophe, just a space. If somebody doesn't know what they're doing with that, the indexer, they might put it thinking that's a middle name of some kind. There could be one L or two L's here. Here's some other forms of that very same name, because it's literally, it's son of Donald, right? Anything that's like this is son of Donald. So these are other forms of that. All right. Here's one that's really, really a bag of worms here. McGuire. So we have John McGuire, and here's how he's turning out. He could have the space in. He could have it all run together in a lowercase g. He could not have a C in it at all. This is not uncommon. He could have a MacWire. He could be MacWire with a W. He could just be MacWire. These are all spellings I've seen for this name. So I actually was using the census online. I think it was on Ancestry, and I was working on a McVeigh, and I only found them on half the censuses. And I thought, gee, what's going on here? And I realized I was doing it with the space in it. So I took the space out and searched again, and then I found the rest of them. Sometimes the census taker wrote it down without the space in it. So it could be the way the person's name actually was, or it could just be the way the census taker wrote it down. Here's a French sample of the name Lebel. We have Mimi Lebel here, and any of that could be La or Le. And you can just see some of the spellings, and she could end up as Mimi L. Bell or just Bell. So sometimes when I'm looking for somebody in a census, you know, one day I was really looking hard and I wasn't finding the person I was after. It was the French surname Chambard. It's spelled Chambard, and I wasn't finding them. And I just had the very strong impression to, next time I went to the library, to pull out the old printed book index and just look at all the surnames that started Cham. Well, I did, and it turned out the father's name was Frederick, and there was spelled the French way. And when I found him, his name was spelled Chambers. So, you know, the way he pronounced it, Chambard, that just, you don't hit the end of that hard in French. And so to the person who wrote it down, it sounded like Chambers, Chamber or Chambers. And so sometimes sometimes the problem is it's a whole different spelling, and we just don't even have a clue what it could turn out to be, or there's been a weirdo typo. And sometimes that's why a printed index is still really helpful, because sometimes by scanning the pages, you can still figure that out. Now here's a Hispanic example of what happens to, we have Jose Benavides Sanchez. My German family married in with the Benavides and the De la Garças in Texas, so I have an interest in this. So Jose Benavides could have wound up just as Sanchez with both his names, with a hyphen or with this Y in between there. He could just be one or the other, or if he's anglicized, he could be Joe. And you have to expect anything, you know, really, like I was saying before with those. So let's talk about nicknames for a minute, because that could be another curse of the genealogist. Here's a whole bunch of them for the lady names. And sometimes it always floors me when the nickname is longer than the name, but it actually is true sometimes. I missed the first 3 times I read the marriage records of a county in Tennessee, where my ancestor Margaret Cowan was married. I missed her marriage record because I wasn't thinking. In those days, I was young and thought that everybody would certainly put their whole formal name on such a formal, important document. Well, her name, and the 3rd time I went through the list, this gong went off in my head. My best friend in junior high and high school was a girl named Margaret, but she hated her name and she always went by Peggy. And I thought, oh my goodness, I can't believe I was so slow to think of that. But I went back and there she was, Peggy Cowan, my great grandmother, and she had put her nickname on her marriage record. So that happens. We've got the same thing with men. Like Alexander has all kinds of nicknames. We have Albert with all kinds of nicknames, Robert with all kinds of nicknames. And you know, you have somebody being called Bert, that's probably a nickname, and it could be from any of these names that have a Bert on the end of them. The same thing with Frederick. Fred could be the nickname for any of these names here in the line right by it. So something to think about. And I've had that happen to me many times. And then when you get back early enough, in most places, the records will revert to Latin. In my part of Germany, where where I've done the most research, this happens in 1820, that the records switch from Latin to German. So before that, your John, will be, your Johann might be in any one of these forms, because they actually kind of decline the names, and the endings of these names signify the relationship of that person to other persons in the record. And so these are some of the ladies tend to get an AE ending on the end of their names in Latin. I have the surname, I have a number of guys named Christian in the family, and in Latin, this is either represented as Xtian or Xian, because the X literally represents the cross, so it represents Christ. I also have the surname Crispin, and so that is represented in the old Latin records as Xman. So if you have a name that can be abbreviated in Latin, you might keep an eye out. If you're not finding your name the way you know it, you might be looking out for some other version like this. And remember that in Latin, a tailor is a Sartor, but in German, it's a Schneider. So if they did any kind of translating of surnames in that way, and some of those name endings in Latin signify whether the person is alive or dead. Now, here's alphabetical order in German, almost. Okay, here's the rest of it. All right, so they have the 26 letters we do, and then they have 3 vowels which have the umlaut over them, which can actually be spelled out with an E, A-E, or O-E, or U-E. And when you're going to look at indexed records from another country, you need to find out how they're going to do that. If they're going to put this A right after this A, or whether it's going to be after Z. I know about freaked out when I was doing Swedish research at first, and they have the same umlaut O and some other letters like this, and I couldn't find the O surname I was after. Well, it was because it had one of those diacriticals above it, and I had to go after the Z, and then I found the listing for the names that started that way. And this other letter that's had in German is the SZ. It's a double S. It's never on the front end of a name. It's in the middle or at the end of a name. So that won't probably be a problem for you, except that it can, depending on who's writing it, it can kind of look like a pair of F's or a pair of S's or something. And so you might keep in mind that, that watch out for that letter, These are the diacritical marks. This is a chart I found of the vast majority of them, at least for the European and North and South American type surnames. And so these change these change the sound of letters, these change the pronunciation. So this may be why in America that your ancestor's name pronounces a certain way, but you wonder why, because it doesn't look that way. It's because they've lost the diacritical, but they've kept the sound. So what are you going to need to do? You're going to need to locate more information on the language of your immigrants. You're going to locate a basic language guide and a word list, find out how those letters are pronounced, find out what the accent sounds like, and remember that English anywhere but the United States sounds different, and even it sounds different in different areas of the United States, right? So, all right. here we are at Family Search at the German genealogy page of the Family Search Wiki. And one of the things, there's a whole getting started section at the top of the page, and then off to the far left, there's this section about beginning research, and then it says reading the records. You can see here's a German word list, a Latin word list, and a French word list, all of which would be very helpful for doing German research. They have handwriting guides, language information, and this is a link to the script tutorial at Brigham Young University. So there's a page like this for all the countries, and you'll be able to find these things. So one place I recommend, a lot of them are really good. Some of them are better than others. I've looked at a lot of them for different countries, and some of them are definitely better. The German stuff is really good. And so I would say use this, but don't stop here, because I've also, this is what I clicked on. I clicked on the word list page, and it shows right here where you can, it's a downloadable. You can see there's a PDF link there where you could actually download the German word list and then have that on your computer or whatever, so you can use it. And they show you, like, here's some associated countries, a lot of that are very Germanic, where a lot of this would also apply. There's handwriting help, there's paleography, there's a paleography seminar, and another webinar you can watch on Old German script here that they put links up for. So a lot of helpful stuff. And there's a link to the Latin word list. And then it shows you the other countries where German is spoken, or that are Germanic. And then they went down the list and started talking about some letters that are substitutable in German, a P and the B, the T for the D. Like, our Gerhard here, his name is actually Gerhard. And so the D at the end in German most often comes up with a T sound or a DT sound. And the R's are very soft, and the interior R's, or the ending R's in German, are very soft. The opening R would be a rolled, hard, more guttural R. So just by using these lists and getting a feel for what things sound like, I'll show you something else. Oh, and they also give you some ideas of what some of the common mistakes are in transcription of those. I found another site called Wikibooks, and they have a German grammar and alphabet and pronunciation section, where if you see this, the little arrow up here in the CC, when you can click on these and you will hear somebody pronouncing all these letters out loud for you. And then they also have descriptives about the A in German is a long A, as in father, the ah sound. So it gives you the ability to figure out what things sounded like pronounced. This is, there's combined letters that have a sound of their own in German. And so you can click on these audio things here and hear this all pronounced. And so this would be available for other languages as well. I'm just using German as my example. But that's a neat feature of the computer now, is we don't have to wonder how things sound. The funny thing is, when I started doing German research, the Germans I was researching were the ones that came over to Texas. Well, my cousin Ken, who's only about 4 years older than me, grew up right there in Fredericksburg, Texas, and he did not speak anything but German until he went to school. And he still has a sort of a German cadence to when he talks. But the interesting thing about that was he was teaching me what the surnames for our family, how they're pronounced. And when I actually went to Germany and spoke to people there, I found out that my cousin Ken's German has a Texas accent. And they actually call it German Texan. And it's a dying language right now. But it changed because once the people came over, when new things came along and new inventions, they had to invent a word for it. And so they didn't do it the same way as the people in Germany did. So it's kind of a dialect at this point. Let's talk about indexing issues for a minute here. So some of those are name variations, typos, and indexing errors, some things we've talked about. I want to show you, I was looking for a tally family, And this was in a book index. And these are all the things that came up. If I had only looked for it spelled this way, I would have missed, somebody actually mistyped this, did a double typo here, left something out of this name and added, so now this tally has 3 L's. But there's also tallies without the E on them here. So in order to see this whole thing, you have to look a little farther on this index page. Now, how would you go about this electronically? Well, this is how you would break that brick wall. You would do a search for TALL, then put, and I don't use the question mark. That's only for one letter. If you use the asterisk, this works, I know for sure, on Ancestry and on Family Search. If you use the asterisk, it'll bring up hits where there's nothing here, or hits where there's one or more letters here. So a searching this way will bring up all of these versions of tally, even the triple letter one. That is obviously wrong. If you just search with one L and put the asterisk in there, it'll bring all of the above, plus you'll also get the 1L versions of variants of this name. So for me, being able to do wildcard searching has helped me find a lot more people in a lot less time. So I highly recommend messing around with that if you haven't done that before, and just experimenting and seeing what that does. I want to tell you about the surname Pedipool. I learned about this was a surname of a good friend of mine, and I helped her research it quite a bit. It turns out now that the Pedipool, there's only one source of Pedipools in England. There was only one Pedipool family, and it dotted down to where there was only one son, William, left, and he left for Virginia. So everybody in the United States whose name is Pedipool is related. But the name got spelled in many different ways in the records. And so you can see Pedipool all run together, with or without the E on the end, Pedipool in two words, with an I in between, with or without the E. Sometimes it just wound up being pool. But a very fascinating thing happened where people started abbreviating it and these are in actual documents. They would just do P apostrophe or just the P, two P's together. And so if you're looking at that, you'd think that was a typo, but that is really a honest to gosh spelling of that name. Recently, I discovered even more forms of this name. So why is this important? Well, for one thing, this kind of make these names come out in a way different spot in alphabetical order. In a SoundX, if some of you remember what SoundX searching is like, a lot of records besides the census were SoundX indexed by the government and other entities. And that SoundX is still used as one of the ways to index. You can see it. I'll show you an example of it on Ancestry. But what happens is the SoundX, you make a code and it's the first letter of the surname plus the next 3 consonants. Double letters don't count. You just use one of those letters. And then if you run out of consonants, you fill in the rest with zeros. So it turns out that the original spellings we were looking under end up as P314, whereas the later spellings and some of the simplified spellings are all under P400. So what happened was she and I had been researching, doing all the census records, but we were only finding part of the people part of the time. Sometimes we'd find them in one census, but not in another. And one day, I don't know which of us said it. I might have said, I think I said it to her, but I said, you know what? Have we ever figured out what the code would be just like for these versions of the spelling? And so we went to the chart and did it and found out it was P400, which is way off of P314. So I want to show you an example of, here I am looking for a surname, the Gates surname, and I happen to be, and you click on this exact thing. If you click on that, it pops up this little chart where you have a choice, and you can leave it at exact and sounds like, or you can down here click on these boxes. The first one is sounds like, the second similar, and the third one is actually SoundX. So if you want it to do a SoundX and bring up things that are not alphabetically but sound, alike, but SoundX alike, then you can use this box to do that. So I don't know, how many people know that, but I wanted you to know it. What I was looking up was the Gates surname, because on the 1880 census, I couldn't find George Washington Gates. Well, if you can see him here, if you can see him here in this example, somebody spelled Gates, G-H-A-T-E-S. I was looking for somebody else. There wasn't an index done for the 1880 census for Ohio at this point. So I was just reading through the census, looking for other people. And all of a sudden, my attention was drawn to this entry. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's why I couldn't find him. Because that wouldn't, even if there had been an index, I wouldn't have been able to find him. Because I wouldn't have known to look under GH. What I always do when names are being wildly misspelled is I look at the top of the page for the name of the enumerator, because I want to see if he comes from the same ethnic group as the group of people he's doing. And this looks like either Sander or Sauder. No, it's Sauder, I think, because there's the N for Henry. And so I'm not sure if that's a German name or not. But in any case, he wasn't doing well with some of these names. This isn't very easy to read, but if you can see across the top here, I was looking for my Wilhelm Junke, right? And I could not find him in the 1850 census right off the bat for Fredericksburg in Gillespie County, Texas. And if you see what happened, this surname, his whole family, it's actually being spelled the way I have it at the top here, Y-E-N-K-E-Y. And I thought, oh, for sure, that there's no German taking this census. They were almost all just Germans living in this area where nobody had lived before. And none of them were, in fact, while they were coming to a German colony in Mexico. And while they were on the ship on the way over, the war broke out with Mexico. And by the time they landed, they were in American territory. So they had to send an American there to take the census because none of these guys knew what to do. I looked at his name. It's Henry K. Judd. There is no way Henry K. Judd is a German name, and he did not. You should, if you ever need a good giggle, you should just read this census, because he spells all the German names phonetically. I had to read through and say them out loud to myself to figure out where everybody was. This is another family that I did a lot of research for as a client, and the name is Habrecht, but you can see that the R's are not pronounced really hard. And so the census takers almost always missed one or both of the R's. And so this was his birth record in Germany, where his name was actually written with a P. By the time he got to America, his name was Leonard. He was spelling it with a B. And you can see that here, there's no R showing. So just Habrecht. This one is just, I don't know what was going on with that census taker. It is just so far out. And I looked at it myself, and it's very clearly written like this. Here's Habrecht. So you can see this name has taken a beating over the course of time. But if you understand, we actually, there was no indexing. We did this a long time ago. We actually had to page through the census. Luckily, it was in a low population area. But we actually had for the 1850, 60, 70, and 80, had to page by page. And we found them, but they were always, way misspelled, so that SoundX wouldn't have helped us or anything. There was a name when I was working on I can't remember which southern state it was, but there was this name that was so common. It was Tala. And I kept thinking, wow, that's interesting. I've never heard of it before. And yet it's so common here. But this was a southern state. And it finally hit me that the name was really Taylor. And that's how it was coming out with a deep South accent. What you have to understand about the 1870 census is at that time, most southern states were just being reinstated into the United States. They were still hostile and sore about having lost the war, and they were extremely uncooperative with the census takers. And they actually had to send Northerners down there to take the census to make sure it was even done. So that inflamed everybody down there even more. So that if you have trouble with the 1870 census in the South, this will be part of the reason why. Okay. There's some Dutch examples I wanted to talk about where accent and how that changes a name. This is a name that I researched for a long time. They wound up in Ohio and Michigan. And when I first saw it, I thought the name was Dalinga. Well, if you know Dini Hatsma from BYU, she's the one who taught me Dutch. And she says, it's Dalingha, Dalingha, because the G has a ha sound. And this is a first name, Engine, but actually when it's pronounced out loud, it comes out Emptrin, Emptrin. So that G gets a really soft CH sound in there. Now, this is a location where a lot of the people I researched came from. It's a province and a city in northern Netherlands. And it looks like, well, it looks like Groningen or Groningen, but how it's really pronounced because of that G is Groningen, Groningen. And this is the Dutch word for Margaret. And it's actually, it's not Gretje, it's Gritje. Gritje is how that's pronounced. And you can always tell male from female given names because by that. The J-E ending is always girls. So anyway, so that's something to think about. Now, in my parish records, when I've been going through those, I've done a lot of Catholic research, thanks to my Germans being, a lot of them are Catholic. And I'll be going along, you know, and you'll just be getting pretty good with the handwriting when all of a sudden the handwriting changes. You've now got a new priest in town. What I try to always do when that happens is look over at his signature and see what his name is, because I do that and I'll go, uh-oh, there's nobody ever been in this parish by that surname. So he's not a local. There's so many dialects in German and so many ways you can spell things. So, you know, I noticed I had this surname of Brach, which is actually pronounced Brach, like there's a C, an ending H carries a C sound with it. So suddenly those people were, when this new guy showed up, suddenly they were gone, but a Pra family appeared and they had the same first names. And I remember going up to the desk, the help desk where I was researching and saying, because I was pretty new at the German at the time. And I said, what went on here? So this family, suddenly their name is with a P now instead of a B. And they said, oh, well, B and P are interchangeable in German. And D and T and G and K and C and K. In fact, when in Latin, when they're spelling the place where some of my ancestors come from, in the Old Church books, it's spelled with a C, Kadenbach, but later on, it's with the K. Whoopsie. So anyway, I realized that new priest was spelling things as he did where he came from. And so that clued me off to just be watching for some of these different things to happen. And boy, they did. And I was glad I had good people to help me. Now, there's some misleading terminology to avoid with names and when we're putting names in a database or whatever. And one thing that is really is a problem, it makes searching very difficult, is when people insist upon putting occupational titles or military ranks in as part of the first name. That shouldn't be included there. Usually the only titles that should be given listed like that are titles that the person had at birth. The way a name should always be listed when you're putting it in a database or on a group sheet or something is the way the name was at birth. That's why putting senior after a name is not correct. That's because nobody is born senior. And they have a junior and become senior later in life, which is sometimes used as a designation too. So people don't get the wrong mail and things, but that's really not that's not part of their official name. Senior is never a part of an official name. So other things that become problematic is when people do not understand the unknown surname indicators that are used in records at times. UNK would be unknown, or DNK is do not know, and NN is no name, or in the Latin, nomen nescio, name unknown. Sometimes people will put in ditto for a name or unknown. In Latin, I've seen this, oh golly, misspelled there. So that's supposed to be unbaptized babies are often recorded as anonyma if it's female or anonymous if it's male. You and I can see that that's the word for anonymous, can't we? That means that's somebody without a name, an unnamed person. That's not a name. That's a term to explain why there is no name. And I have seen all kinds of it. You can just try it. Use family search and look up anonyma as a first name, and you will get hits. And the same with anonymous. So that's people, who didn't know what they were doing when they index it. But that could be a problem for somebody looking for that name. So whenever they're a part of my family, I always make sure I change them and leave that name field blank. So that won't be a problem. Now, what you should know is that ditto is a real Italian surname. So that if you put that in a name field, you're now part of the ditto family. You're now Italian. And UNK is a real Dutch surname. And if you put that in a name field, you're now part of a Dutch family. And you probably don't want them, and they probably don't want you. So you need to, that's a hard thing. If you start putting this sort of thing in a database, if are people after you're long gone, are they going to know what you meant by that? I sometimes think I need to have a key for my research, but I don't know that people will find that key or see that key and understand. So I try to be as clear as possible. And I try to, when I have a blank like that, I try to put in the notes, It said anonyma, and that means an anonymous or an unnamed female who died before she was baptized. Put something like that to explain it. Don't just leave it to the imagination. So misunderstanding of record layout is also a problem. You need to get to know the record and the way the wording is. And usually the record keepers do the same thing over and over. So once you figure out the format, the way they're doing it, you're okay. And sometimes they'll put the occupation name right after a man's surname. And I have seen where I have gone back to records I have used myself to look somebody to, and they're showing me here's some possible matches maybe for your name, and I click it up, and somebody had actually added that surname to the surname, or that occupation name to the surname section. And, I've had to take that out and make an explanation of that's just the surname or the occupation name that's listed with the names in this particular record set. A child is sometimes in the old Latin records listed before the child's name be listed before the father's name without a comma in between. And so suddenly you have this person that looks like they have 4 names or something. If you don't understand how the priest is doing that, you'll be confused and possibly miss the person that you're after. In Germany, one thing that threw me at first was that the record books when they started doing printed books, the record books have very narrow columns. And they will write half a name on one line and the rest on the next line. And there's no hyphen or any kind of indicator that they have split a name. And I'd be looking at these things going, where did that name come from? I've never seen that name in the parish before. And somehow somebody who knew what they were, you know, I always had friends who knew more about it than I did at that time. And so I'd ask them. Anyway, they go, look, the rest of the surnames over here. And I go, yeah, but there's no hyphen. And they go, hey, they don't put a hyphen. You just have to get over it. And you just have to watch for split names like that. So expect the unexpected. And there are indexing snafus. And some of those are, if a first letter gets lost or misread, like Norris versus Morris or Sanderson versus Anderson, you know, that's going to throw you. So if you're not finding the name, you might want to do a wildcard search where you replace the first letter or the first two letters and just look for names that end the way you need the name to end and see if you can pick up the person you're after that way. You know,
Laurie, are you about at a good stopping point? It's nearly 11:30.
Oh, okay. I guess I could be.
You can have another hour. So anyway, you can finish this up later, or are you near the end of this part?
There's a few more slides, not too many.
Go ahead and finish this up now then.
Okay. So, you know, you've got to watch out for those names that are in multiple parts. Remember the wildcard search. Try thinking about a name with a sound-alike letter. And sometimes I just tell people, close your eyes and just say the name and think of, if you didn't know how that was spelled, how many different ways could you spell it? Try searching with or without space when you have a multiple part name. And think about the way letters look in old handwriting. A lot of people mistake an uppercase L for an uppercase S. I've actually seen people write L-M-I-T-H, and I'm thinking, wouldn't you just wonder, you know, that those two letters don't go like that in English, you know, so you know, that's something to think about. I wanted to show you a little example of my friend Newcomb Mead. Over the course of my research in Newcomb, from the beginning of the census, from about, I think 1810 onwards, I found his first name in all of these different versions, and I found his last name in all of these different versions. So you can figure out how many permutations there would be by, you know, mixing and matching those two. And so now that I know this happens with Newcomb, what can I do? Well, here's and you know, sometimes a lot of surnames have people make a curlicue in their handwriting. And sometimes we try to read an S into that, but it might not be, but it might have been indexed that way. Anyway, so here's how you would handle that. You could wildcard search for Newcomb in any one of these three ways and come up with all those spelling. The third one here for sure would bring up all those spellings I just showed you. And with this one version, you could pick up all the Mead variations I showed. And you know what? If you really want to, you can combine these two for maximum focus and come up with all the Newcomb Meads. And so, you know, that's something. Some of our ancestors actually changed their name on purpose because of deliberate, you know, it's a deliberate deception. Or they had a deliberate occurrence in their life, like a marriage, an adoption, a remarriage of the mother, and sometimes she takes the children with her and gives them a new surname. Divorce or estrangement can lead to a woman reverting to her surname or maiden surname. At immigration, people can decide, I don't know if you know this, but the one time you could change your name just without having to go to court, you know, and do a special process was on your final immigration papers. You could request to write the name you wanted to go by in America. have them pen that one in. And then that would be your name change right there. I've heard a lot of different things about immigration records, and I never heard that one. So fear of being located for whatever the reason, maybe somebody's hiding an illegitimacy, escaping past crimes or deaths, hiding a race or ethnicity. There might be inheritance stipulations about having to have a surname, a certain surname to inherit, to honor a deceased person with no male offspring, like shelter, to escape, an ethnic or racial background. I knew there was a guy who was he was actually Black, but he could pass for Hispanic, so he did that in Texas, and he became a very wealthy and popular guy in society. And he changed his name to a Hispanic surname, and it worked for him. So maybe they're going to change the name to the name they've actually been using day to day, not the one they were originally given. Maybe to dissociate from a family black sheep. I am sure everybody in Hitler's family changed their last name. And in Sweden, they do things like changing the name of soldiers. I did, in the Swedish research I did for my cousin, when one of their ancestors had to serve in the military, they couldn't have like 10 people named Hansen and get all confused during the battle. So they would they had a set of names they used for soldiers, and he got that surname Pale, which actually means arrow. So sometimes they were names of weaponry or other things that just as long as it wasn't patronymic. In 1887, a law was passed in the United States that stated that all Indigenous Americans must adopt a surname. So it's at that point in time where if you have Native American ancestry, that your ancestor will then have two names, because they never gave up their Indigenous name, but they had an Anglo name they went by as well. And then sometimes people just change their name to make them more attractive, unpronounceable, or less odd or something. Or if they became a religiosum or a votary, such as a priest or a nun, or if they had a religious conversion or a deconversion. Sometimes people create a new name. There was a Suey Smith, literally, that's what the man's name was, who married an Ann Hedges, and they had a son, William Suey Smith, in 1830. He grew up to be a Union general in the Civil War, and he was the famous builder of caisson bridges. In fact, I could name bridges and you'd recognize the bridges that he built. But when he had a son, when his son Charles was born, he decided to change the family name to Suey Smith. And that's the way he made sure his son's name was changed legally. And from there on, the family is Suey Smith. I've never found an explanation of why he did it, except maybe he just got tired of being a Smith, and wanted to get some uniqueness into the name. But that helped. I mean, when I was going backwards on the family, I had to find that, or I would not have been able to go farther. There's religious conversions, like I mentioned. The two most famous ones that I can remember, when Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali and Lou Alcindor became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So this is when I just wanted to show you a tombstone. And this is from Medina County, Ohio, where I've done a lot of research. And here's the family tombstone with he and his wife on it, and there's their surname Hat. But if you see this close up, if you see his side of it close up, there's this longer name in parentheses, Hathazi, and that is their original surname. I would never have known that, if I hadn't seen that on this tombstone. That was a really nice move by somebody to put that there. So, and it's a Hungarian surname from the Magyar area of Stockholm over there. And so that's what it looks like super close up. I just thought that was really cool. I found a surname distribution map. You can see where it's showing up only there in Hungary and Romania, and in the United States and Canada, really. So, and I used another one named Pedia to look it up, and I found that there's only 37 people with the name of that Hathazi name that are there. And this shows the regions of Hungary where they still are there today. So news ancestors did legal name changes. This is an article I gave a link to about finding that sort of thing in newspapers, because legal actions were reported in the newspaper. You can also, there's official name change records that you can locate. I just looked up for the United States, and in Kentucky under names personal, I found Kentucky frontiersmen located in the census and county records, name changes, legitimization and adoptions, and so that would be something to look at if you had Kentucky people. In the United States, legal records of name change are done on the state level. Go to the Family Search Catalog, select the state, and then just look for that category, like I said. And I found for these states here that there are some records available there, and other countries that have them as well. Let's see. Well, there are naming patterns in families in other countries. I'll just skip through that. And they often have more names than we do in Europe and use them differently. My family, all these Pales, they were all Johans, but they all went by their middle names. They had to have a saint name. They were Catholic. So, that's how that sort of thing happens. So in a number of religions, Judaism, Catholicism, even names have for instance, there are certain names that if your ancestor was Catholic, they would never have certain first names. And if they were Protestant, there are certain names they would never have. And so just something to keep in mind. So now you're ready to dig in deeper on surnames. Wow, okay. There.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Well, you had some wonderful information there for us, Laurie. I've got a bunch of questions, but we don't have time for questions. That was just so good. There's so many things. I'm glad we have that recorded. Wonderful. Okay, now
there's a lot. I put a lot of different links to a lot of things in the syllabus there.
Handout. Yeah, if people logged on differently later. Gerhard, maybe you could copy that handout link again, because if you logged on in Zoom later, you wouldn't see the handout, the link that's there. But she's got a great handout that she put together with all this information on it. Really helpful stuff. Now, we'll take a short break. If you're on Zoom and you're a member of our group, just hang on Zoom, because now we're going to have the election. We're going to turn the time over to Gerhard here in just a second. And if you're on Facebook, turn back on in a few minutes, and maybe you'll have to shorten your other presentation because it's already 20 minutes now to 12, Laurie, but you could do the other presentation and maybe give us half of the total thing or something of that nature. Okay, Gerhard, let's turn the time over to you right now to get started with our elections. Are you there? Gerhard, we don't hear you. You're still muted. And we do not hear you. Is there a problem there in the chapel? Anybody else that's there in the red chapel?
Don?
Yeah.
Another thing we could do, if you want to, is I could just do Q&A, and I can do that other one next time or something. I don't know.
Hey, that's a good possibility. I'm anxious to see that your surname distribution program, and I don't want to shorten that if we don't have to. So
yeah,
maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we do that for a class next time or something.
Wait, what's going on?
Where's Gerhard? We can't get him back on here. He's still muted, and we don't know. Is there anybody else?
Somehow I got muted. I'm sorry.
Oh, there you go.
I was trying to suggest what Laurie suggested. We'll use, let's use, there were some comments online on Facebook.
Oh, okay.
Handle just those and see if there are any questions from the people online here in Zoom.
Good.
Okay.
and terminate the broadcast at that point in time. We'll do
Okay.
the elections and do Laurie's other class next month.
Okay.
That's a great idea. Okay.
Well, good.
Yeah.
I'm all ready.
Actually, as long as this one, if we stop in the middle and then restart, that would work also.
Okay. So
Anyway,
now,
this is such a wealth of information, Laurie. I am overwhelmed by what you have covered, your experience has been. And congratulations on sounding out my first name in German correctly. That is really hard for people to do. You know, the word Gerhard is not a common English pronunciation. Hey, by the way, one thing you didn't mention on the German pronunciation, the R in Gerhard sounds like just a little twist of an A when it's at the end of a syllable. But if it's at the beginning of a syllable, like on my last name, it's always rolled way back in the throat. And that's, I can't roll my R's the way Americans do, up in with the tip of my tongue.
You know,
I have to roll it in the back of my throat. But anyway, there are all kinds of interesting variations there.
I have a hard time rolling the German R far enough back because I took French, and French is part way back, not all the way back. And that's the one I can really roll.
Let me share with you a couple of comments that came from the people on Facebook.
Okay.
When you were talking about Myers spelling, Linda online noted a spelling she had seen, M-Y-H-R-E.
Oh, yes. That is very valid.
M-Y-H-R-E. Another comment online is somebody took issue with Portugal is not Hispanic, was her comment.
Well, okay, I should have said Iberian. Okay.
Yes.
I stand corrected.
Anyway,
I said corrected.
that
What?
person does have a very Spanish name. I couldn't pronounce it.
Well,
there was also a comment on from Erica regarding Catholic records, particularly. She says they would use the Latinized name in the church records, even if the person went by their regular name in other records.
oh, definitely.
That was a comment that was made online.
They did, you know, and when I was fine. I mean, I was really getting with it in German. And then I got to the next generation backwards and I hit the Latin part and I went, oh my.
Right.
Something happened here and I've got to get a handle on it. And the really neat thing was just not too long after that, it was the time for the, it was going to be time for the BYU Family History Conference. And in those days, they were super good. They actually had in-depth things where you'd sign up and like for 3 hours every morning, you'd do German research or you'd do, well, that year, 3 hours every morning was Latin research. It was Latin for genealogists. And I've got the handbook to it and it just changed my life. And that's all I had to do was spend those many hours and I could handle the names and a lot of what goes on in those Latin records. You know, I understand well enough to get by, but I was really grateful that I had my eyes open and was watching, but because back then there weren't, you know, things weren't online. There weren't classes online, you know. I don't know when, how else I would have been able to get that knowledge right then, but there it was right when I needed it. And so I really liked when they did those in-depth classes at the BYU conference.
Great. By the way, for those of you that are on Zoom, now is a good time for you to unmute your microphone and ask any questions or make any comments that you would like to make.
By all means.
Are we still live on Facebook?
We are still live on Facebook until we terminate this. Yes.
Okay.
Good. Here's a couple of comments. You mentioned that frequently Christ was abbreviated with an X.
Uh-huh.
It occurred to me then that we see Xmas for Christmas. People
Yes.
think, oh gosh, that's not respectful. It was done for respect, so that they would not have to say Christ.
It was.
X was. It was exactly the opposite of what people think.
I know. I stood corrected. I always thought that was rather tacky to put the X in there.
Yeah.
People were too lazy to write out the whole thing. But the other thing I learned about that using the X was that Christians were trying to identify each other back when it wasn't cool to be Christian, several hundred years ago. And so they would, the X sort of represented a cross tipped on it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so they would just use that as a symbol, and people would know, oh, there's where this is somebody Christian. There's where the Christians are, because that X would be on things.
When you were mentioning about the name unknown and this sort of thing, it occurred to me that I saw once, in fact, several times, NMI.
No middle initial or something?
No middle initial, right. And people actually thought that was the middle name. And so you see that a lot.
One thing that I learned for this time about British names is that British people had two names. They just had two names. And when they came to America, they just had two names. So this picking up of, if you see an early person in America that's British, that's got a pack of names on them, it's probably not right. It could easily be a couple of people merged together erroneously, because people back then just didn't do the middle name thing.
Yeah, that's true. The middle names didn't start till sometime in the 1800s.
No, and only, it was the Catholics that had two names, because they had to have a saint, and then they had to have the one they went by every day.
I have a problem with my ancestor Erastus Snow. He once wrote a telegram, and he signed it E. Fairbanks. It was on the Underground in the early days.
Oh.
It said, his name was Erastus Fairbanks Snow. And we didn't know that when we commissioned the book to be written. So that's the title in the book. But his original record, which I've got from St. Johnsbury, Vermont, is just Erastus Snow. The Church Historian's Office, there are several examples of that. They're calling it middle name creep.
I've got it. I've got an ancestor. His name is Abraham Palmer. And half the time he shows up as Abraham Whitney Palmer. That's his mother's maiden name. It's not on any of his official civil or church records, but people in the family keep coming back to Family Search and sticking it in there. And the last time I wrote a big note on there that I hope people notice, so that they don't do that. Because I've looked at loads and loads, and more records probably than anybody else alive has looked for on him, because I've gone to some rare stuff, and he never has it. He never signs his name with an initial. So it's that middle name creep is really a big problem. And when I read that about how the British, obviously somebody named Palmer is British, so they didn't have middle names, and people should stop doing that.
Yeah, there's Erastus wrote a letter when he was later in life and said his mom had named him Erastus Fairbanks for the Fairbanks Scale Company, but that company didn't really exist in St. Johnsbury at the time, so it was later, and so the original record doesn't have that middle name at all.
Oh.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a pain.
Laurie, we do have a comment or question from Merlin. Go ahead,
Okay.
Merlin.
I one time run into a guy who's had RB as his initials, and he had no real name other than RB. And when he was drafted into the Army, his name was written R parentheses only, in parentheses, B parentheses only, and he went through the Army as Ronley Bonley.
Merlin, I thought you were going to say, when you said RB, you know about the Arby's sandwich company, the
I know.
ARBY. That
I
came
thought-
from RB, roast beef. And
Oh,
right by across from BYU was
Yes.
the RB, the Roy Rogers RB place. And that later became Arby's, ARBYS.
that's funny. I thought you were going to say they called them Arby, like ARBY in the
Well, that's-
military or something.
No, that's just that's what they changed the name to, but it comes from roast beef.
That's funny. I'd never put that together. That makes sense.
My middle name is R. And it was named that because my dad's name was Ralph and my mother's name was Ruby, so they just named me R.
Oh, so your middle
Oh.
names are, yeah.
Yeah.
And you don't put a period after them. You
That's
just have,
correct.
yeah, I've got a son-in-law that's middle name is T. And so he's just T with no period. Yeah.
Yeah, John K. Carmack, who used to be a general authority, he was from my ward in California, and it was the first time I'd ever run onto it when I was a kid. He only had K. He only had a middle initial, but when his first child was born, her name was Lisa, and they gave her K-A-Y for her middle name after him.
Oh, after him, yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting how and so if we have names like this and we know the story of it, we need to write it down, so that, people aren't looking for your middle name that starts with R, that is just R period, so that
Yeah, right.
that kind of stuff. I know.
Gerhard has posted again on, if you're on Zoom, he has posted again on the chat, the link to where you can get Laurie's handout. So it'll be there.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you saw I put it there, right? Again, here
It-
just
it-
a few minutes
it's on
ago.
their
Yeah,
second
I
time.
did.
It's on their second
It's
time
like it's like 9 pages long. I read a lot of great articles that I learned a lot from about names, and I put links to a bunch of those. They deal with different aspects. There's so many different aspects of names. I didn't even touch on all of them today. It's just, but the ones I think are most important to keep in mind when you're starting out, and that I need to remind myself of regularly, so I don't go, oh,
Yeah.
he wasn't there, before I've really tried everything. So
There is a Guild of One Name Studies, which is an English organization. I was the
Yep.
Snow representative, and they would have, every surname would have a representative, regardless of how it was spelled. And our goal was to pick up any information worldwide about that surname, and we were all listed as who represented that surname, so you could write to them, and they would ask questions, and they would have information.
I put that it's on the front page of my handout in the second section under name search
Oh,
resources.
good. I'm glad you got
And
that.
also I put down there the link to where you can find some of their stuff it's under genealogies under search on familysearch.org. So you go to familysearch.org, then search. Then if you click genealogies, several different things come up that you can click on. And one of them is Guild of One Name Studies. They posted a lot of their research there.
Oh,
And that's really high quality research. So
yeah.
I would, I finally found a name I'm interested in that they have a one name study for. So I'm kind of excited to poke around on that a bit.
Yeah.
Laurie, we have one more comment or question here from Jackson here at the church.
Okay.
You know me as an Anderson, and Marie in her email used Anderson Glad a lot. The reason for that, our great-grandfather, Niels Peter Anderson, he was an immigrant from Denmark, and he was one of the last legal polygamists in the church. But he went back to Denmark and did some genealogy research and found that on early records, the clan name of Glad was attached to early records.
Oh.
And so when he came back, he encouraged all his children to legally change their name to Glad.
Oh,
My
Oh,
grandfather, Ephraim Anderson, did use Glad during World War I military service. But when he came back to Salt Lake and went into the cleaning and dyeing business, he reverted to Anderson. That's why I'm an Anderson and not a Glad. And I've got a ton of Glad cousins.
wow.
Good story.
That sounds like, you know, what they did over there. They passed laws in all the Scandinavian countries at some point. I think Norway wasn't until 1923, but, you know, like I said, in Sweden, things began in about 1860. But what they would do was they would sometimes attach the farm name to the end of the name.
Right.
And sometimes when they had to choose a permanent surname to stick with, they chose that farm name. But here's one other thing to know about the Scandinavian names is that, so when the laws were passed, some of the children of a family might have been out and married and on their own and conducting business with their patronymic surname from the dad and might have frozen there. The kids who were still at home, they had a choice of whether to take dad's surname or to pick a different surname. And so in these Scandinavian countries, at the times when they're changing, when these laws are coming down that everybody has to now take a surname, you end up with siblings, a lot of siblings with different names.
Yeah, right.
So, you know, it's just, people say, well, oh, Scandinavian, I hope I don't have to do any of that research. And despite those complications, I love it. There are so many good records, and you actually can walk your way back through them and survive it because they put full birth dates and all that. And anyway, not to worry about Scandinavian research. You will survive if anybody is listening and needs to hear
Here's
that.
another question I've got. I'm wondering if there is any search engine, Google doesn't do it, but anything else that does, where it would take into account these different sorts of names. Now, the one thing that I do remember is that some of you know Dallin Quast and his gopher, what's it called? That one that where he searches through the book.
Oh, genealogy gophers. I love that.
Yeah. Well, he searches through only 80,000 of the books that are on the church website, but he does it by, if you type in John, it will also search for Juan and Johann and all these other names as well, and nicknames.
He's a superb programmer.
I'm wondering if there's any other search engine that will do that, or is there any way to do, Laurie, you mentioned using asterisks with the wildcards, but I'm wondering
there's a couple of tricks that I'm going to show you in the next class where some of that's possible. It's hard to describe. It's easier to show an example.
Okay.
One of them is actually on Family Search, but you know, there are a lot of things being invented. And what I did, what the next class is going to be like, just in case anybody's wondering, is I call it it's going to be about
distribution maps.
Yeah, the distribution maps, but that's really only half of it. Because what I decided to do was I do some general material about where you can find those maps for a lot of different countries. And then I do some general resources on names, just a few. This is just the front page. And then after that, I go country by country. And under each of the major countries that I chose to do, I have down resources for the mapping and then resources specifics for that country on the names. And there are some of those search engines that have some really neat features built into them.
Well, we'll look forward to that class. We'll probably have that maybe next time, you folks, or whenever we can work that in. So keep watching for that, because that's going to be another valuable class. Now it's probably time for us to close this off. We've still got to have the elections today. So are there any last minute comments or questions that anybody wants to ask?
We have nothing else online.
Okay, then I guess we'll log off from Facebook. And those of you who are members of the group.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh, thanks, Laurie. It's wonderful. We appreciate it. Okay,
Oh.
good enough. Gerhard, turn off Facebook and we'll go ahead with our election.